now. Here, take it
Good.
away.
Thanks. Thanks, Catherine. I appreciate the introduction and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your afternoon or evening to spend it with us. We do appreciate you coming to listen to what we have to say. So my name's Toby Ware-Jones. I'm the Chief Product Officer for Bayshore. I've been in the security business in one way or another for over 20 years now. I've covered off a fairly wide range of different security deployment scenarios, from managed services to standalone hardware and software tools. I've spent some time in telephony. I've dealt with remote monitoring and vehicle telematics. And most recently, I've spent my time in the industrial cybersecurity space. So I have a pretty broad experience with different customer requirements, and I think you'll find I tend to focus on making sure we have a really solid understanding of the basic problems first. And I like to make reference to that because I think it helps to ensure that, for folks who are, trying to catch up and maybe not quite sure of all the details and all the gotchas out there, that we can start from a solid premise. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the agenda. We're going to cover off some basic questions on why business disruption is a problem and what it means to understand threats to business. We'll talk about, of course, an Airgap bridge and how that's our innovation compared to some legacy products. We're going to talk about some technical applications, but then some specific business use cases for these products and how you can make use of them for, I think, scenarios that a lot of different asset owners are going to encounter. We're going to provide a framework for how to understand where you are on a risk tolerance scale and how to prioritize what actions you might take to modify your risk exposure. And then finally, we're going to come back to a summary of what we've covered off today. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So business disruption is important for a very simple reason. And it's important because it's inevitable. Risk is never zero. And we always have to accept, whether or not we know explicitly what the risks are, whether or not we can forecast explicitly what the consequences of risk will be, we have to accept that it's never zero. And as a result, it always has a cost. Now, our hope is that the cost is minimal. Our hope is that we're not the next organization featured on the front page of the Wall Street Journal for some catastrophic cybersecurity incident. But we know that somebody's going to be next. And for all the ones that make it to the front page, there are dozens or hundreds which are ultimately less catastrophic, but still severe. There's still big problems that require expensive and time-consuming remediation. And yet, as I said, this risk is just about inevitable. And that's because of the nature of evolution of networking. When we started building industrial control systems and use automation technologies, the networks that tended to receive them weren't connected to anything else. And the belief was that the people who ran those networks were on site. So there was no, thought given to how to deal with a scenario in which these networks were connected to external points of connectivity and that there were people who had access to them who we couldn't see right in front of us. But nowadays, it's normal. We may not like it. We often hear people talk about, well, I try to keep this network, isolated from other networks. But the reality is that either directly or indirectly, almost none of them are truly isolated anymore. They're not isolated because of, obviously, connectivity, whether it's, modems that are used for emergency maintenance or full bandwidth internet connections or everything in between. But they're also connected because people can carry software in without using the network at all. And that introduces the risk of dangerous software, malware, ransomware, et cetera, without, any realistic control over how it enters our environment. But we also have demands from other stakeholders, and those demands create exposures on their own. We want to support the requests. We want to be good citizens. But when people want to monitor these control networks with full access to the network itself, even though all they have is a reporting requirement, it creates a big exposure. And then the final piece that is the most recent addition to this equation is the notion of cloud analytics. There are services and there are auditing standards, and there are various other scenarios in which our data has to leave our control completely, go into a cloud environment, and the cloud, of course, has a requirement for collectors. And so all of these things have made a dramatic difference to the risk exposure that our previously isolated control systems no longer have. And the question is, what can we do about it? We know the risk has increased. We may not know what that translates to in terms of forecasted spend on remediation, but we can reasonably assume that it's a lot more than it used to be. And so business disruption is, again, it's inevitable. And all that varies is the extent to which it'll affect you next. So the question is, why undertake this expansion at all? And the answer, fortunately, is available now in the form of a unidirectional gateway. A unidirectional gateway, at its core, is a solution which allows you to share data without increasing the network risk. And that is its essential function. It is a mechanism by which you can apply segmentation. You can carve out one asset or a small group of assets, put them behind a unidirectional gateway so they're no longer accessible from the rest of the network, and you can still share data in real time. It's a scenario in which your corporate systems, your ERP, billing and admin, customer service, supply chain, inventory, things like this, they all need to know what kind of resource consumption you've had, what kind of performance reports you've produced, but there's no reason for any of those tools to change how the plant itself operates. And so why even introduce the possibility that they could, even if by accident? And then finally, we have the notion where even if somebody has done some security classification about different zones on their network, there may still be a need for data to move from one zone to another. And those adjacent networks, even if they're differently classified, still have a data exchange requirement. And oftentimes that is a one-way data exchange requirement. So you might say, well, why not use a firewall? And there's some basic reasons why that's the goal. Firewalls ultimately forward packets. Maybe they forward and translate addresses. Maybe they just do straight forwarding. But the issue is that once a device initiates a connection through a firewall, if there's a rule that permits it, that firewall will allow the initiating device to connect directly to the target device. And then a network socket exists between those two devices. Even if one of those devices is outside on the internet in a scary place, running unknown software and operated by a hostile adversary. It doesn't matter. We have suddenly invited that person into our plant and into direct contact with our assets. Unidirectional gateways don't forward packets. They don't establish a direct connection between a source device and a destination device. Instead, they replicate packets out of band. They don't use a network connection at all. And if you're thousands of miles away and you're trying to perpetuate attacks across a network, your lifeblood is the ability to open network connections. I take that away, you are suddenly much less effective. So the benefit here is we allow data to move across the gateway according to the rules and policies we define, but we do not permit any sort of return path network connection back into our sensitive domain. And thus we provide tremendous security because we have real isolation for those targets. Now, we're not the first to envision this basic idea. We believe we've refined it and improved it in a very significant way, and I'm going to share the details of that with you in a little while. But the legacy product is the idea of a data diode. And this is a pure hardware-based approach to the uses I've been describing. Data diodes have been around for a long time, 15, 20 years, and they've never really changed. They use an optical fiber connection between two systems, and on one side you can transmit, and on the other side you can receive. And all the various hardware diode vendors, they offer an ability to sell you a second one, which operates in the reverse direction. And when they do that, you essentially have a bidirectional connection, simply regulated by rules. The NIST has defined this standard in the form of boundary protection. And there's specific language in the NIST guidelines that speaks to it. But the issue is that a boundary, by definition, according to NIST and also according to NERC, Nuclear Energy Regulatory Committee, or Commission, I'm sorry, is that the burden for validating the strength of such a boundary or such a perimeter is reduced for the asset owner when they use a device which does not permit routable network connections back in. And that was a way to define an opportunity for diodes as a superior security control to a firewall. And that's the whole premise on which the diode vendors have expanded their business. And all credit to them. You know, they've established a niche and they've done a good job of servicing it. But we think that the products are expensive. We think they have limited utility outside of the use cases that care about NERC and NIST. And that's generally defined as critical infrastructure, DoD, military, you know, intelligence communities, and other very specialized, cash-rich, high-end markets. But the benefits of isolation and real segmentation for sensitive assets, it's time for that to be democratized. And we believe that the mainstream market is ready for a product that offers the same benefits, the same very high level of security, but in a much better value proposition and with a lot more flexibility on how it can be deployed. So the advent of the Airgap bridge. So Bayshore took this premise that these diodes exist, they're rigidly defined, but that the benefits they offer could be used by a larger audience. And we said, okay, how can we bring such a solution to market? And the things that we noticed about the target environments here is that these automation networks, as I mentioned, they tend to be less structured than a typical enterprise or IT network. They tend to be flatter. There's not as much segmentation, either physically or logically. You know, we have the interesting situation with a regional utility where they'll have multiple sites and they'll have multiple buildings within those sites. But in many cases, all of those different buildings at all of those different sites are all on the same logical address space. It's essentially one big flat network. And the challenge there is, of course, if one node gets compromised, suddenly the propagation event has visibility across the entire plant, which is dangerous. There's not a lot of access control, either physical or logical. The belief is that, you know, these networks are sort of out of the way and, you know, attackers, we always hoped and crossed our fingers, would not really pay much attention to them. But we've seen repeatedly in recent years that that's clearly not true. So that even though a lot of the industrial OEMs have support for encryption tools, for credentialing, for all sorts of different improved security, very rarely are those tools used. And the reason is because these are typically multi-vendor solutions, and introducing security controls from one vendor, you then have all the interoperability issues. And, you know, in the heat of a crisis, generally speaking, that those security controls make it slightly harder to get a handle on what's going on. And that's been one of the burdens of the security industry forever. You know, security decreases utility. That's the belief. And so the challenge there is, you know, we don't want to turn on these features because, you know, when we most need access and speed, those features will get in the way. But finally, the other thing we've noticed is that a lot of the users that could benefit from these sorts of products generally have much smaller budgets than the traditional markets I spoke of earlier. They certainly can't afford the luxury of adding a bunch of staff, and even adding a lot of technology to enable a whole network solution is generally out of reach. So those factors together all combined to create what we believe is the available opportunity for our unidirectional gateway product, which is called SCADAwall. So what is SCADAwall? SCADAwall allows data transfer between domains, from a trusted domain to an external domain, without increasing any kind of network connectivity risk on the return path. And that is the essential goal. So the challenge is, how do we ensure that all of these real-time applications can be told data about our production networks without the users of those external networks being able to get in, look around, interact with our assets, or otherwise cause unauthorized connections and activity. SCADAwall does this by enabling the replication of data from the trusted network to the external side, and you'll see a few different scenarios for how we define that in a minute. but it allows the data to go out at full speed, and it ensures that there is no return path connectivity from external network devices or users back into the production environment. And that maintains the goal of isolation, it maintains the goal of insulation against malware propagation or other workstation level exploits. And we deliver it with very high performance and very attractive price points for the speed we provide. The device can be installed very easily, does not require significant technical skill to set it up. And the intention is that an existing operations staff with one or two sort of SCADA or network engineers can easily get this device up and running and configured for their particular applications, in an afternoon or less. So a little bit of detail about how it works. The intention is that we supply two separate CPUs. So when you buy a SCADA wall, you actually get two servers. One server is designated as blue, that's the trusted domain, and it is connected out of band to the second server, which is called red, and red is the external server. We connect them with a pair of PCI cards, and then just an industry standard PCI interface cable between them. The configuration of the device can be performed only from the trusted side. So we supply a simple Windows desktop application, which allows you to configure the device, define initial rules, and then review logs and verify performance. And that is performed exclusively from blue. So there is no ability to perform administrative events on the red node directly. You configure the blue node, and it then pushes its configuration parameters to red as required. We also further protect the configuration or the access to that admin console with hardware cryptographic keys. So once the customer has deployed the device, verified its configuration, they pull the key from the SCADA wall itself, and they remove it from the Windows workstation where the console is running. And then somebody, even with physical access, can't make further changes because they don't have the necessary hardware keys to do it. So at a high level, that's the basic architecture, but we're going to go into a bit more detail about how it works under the covers. I see there was a question pending. Catherine, did you want to speak to that question now, or do we want to come back to it later?
Yeah, I already answered it. I just did though, so I wanted to be certain of the specifics where IEC 62443 as a very viable and usable standard for manufacturing has come up, and these are the answers. I put it out to everyone. Thanks.
Okay, that's in the chat log for everybody's benefit. Thanks, Catherine. Okay, let's move on. So a little more detail, features and benefits for SCADA wall. So the first and perhaps most important feature and difference between SCADA wall and the hardware diodes is the fact that we offer guaranteed delivery for every message that moves across the system. So in the traditional fiber optic diode category, the sender, the transmitter can happily transmit away, but it has no way to know if the messages it's sending have been successfully and correctly received on the other side. And so the solution for that is to retransmit the messages. And generally speaking, you'll see a lot of retransmission overhead in the hardware diodes in order to ensure that the full integrity of the message is preserved and delivered on the other side. But the danger there is if nobody's watching, and if you have an automation process and Friday afternoon everybody goes home and it fails half an hour later, you've lost essentially a weekend's worth of messages before somebody comes in on Monday to figure out what happened. And there's no way for you to know. There's no automated detection of a failure to deliver. So SCADA wall addresses that directly by offering guaranteed delivery for every message. The other thing we can do, and as you see, we'll support a number of different rule types or transport types, is we can support guaranteed delivery across multiple concurrent sessions. So you're not limited to defining a single rule type or a single transport type. Instead, you have the ability to have multiple rules all operating simultaneously. And SCADA wall will continue to provide guaranteed delivery for all of them in real time. Now, the specific transports we provide, we offer file replication using either FTP or just Windows file share technologies. We do live replication of OPC DA and alarms and events, including very high point counts. We do full Modbus replication for servers, again, with very high register and coil counts. We can provide full speed TCP and UDP stream replication. And every SCADA-wall appliance is gigabit capable out of the box. Now, we sell them in 3 different performance tiers, which start at 50 megabits, then 100 megabits, and then finally full gigabit. But the beauty of it from the point of view of a distributor is they can stock essentially the 50 megabit version, and if they sell a gigabit version, they simply buy the incremental license. They don't need different versions of hardware. It just works. And then finally, as I mentioned, the fact that the device is easily installed through a very familiar sort of Windows user interface allows it to be set up by non-specialists very quickly. A little more detail on how we use these different transport types. So the most common one, I believe, is this notion of log streaming data. And syslog is the standard example, although it's not really limited to that. Syslog works over UDP or TCP. You can configure a rule in SCADA-wall to allow your syslog on your trusted domain to communicate through SCADA-wall and be replicated to a log server in your external domain. So again, this is a very simple way to allow someone on the outside to keep real-time logs on what's going on inside a production network without them having any access to the assets or any access to the log files themselves. So we have the ability to do real-time streaming of high volumes of log data to any destination that the customer has configured in the rules. And it's easy to test, right? I mean, for those of you who are familiar with command line tools, Logger allows you to test it in 30 seconds. Once you've configured the rule, it just works. And there's no challenge there. We're designing it so that it's easy to integrate into a SIM, or if you have a SOC or you use a managed service, if you use analytics tools like Splunk, or you simply want to build a comprehensive archive of logs in a dedicated SAN or some other archiving tool, you can now do that without giving all of those tools direct access to your production network. Next example, with SNMP traps, again, another UDP type transport, easily configured. You define the destination for your traps. And then once you've done that, the intention is that the SNMP traps can be pushed to a destination directly. And again, there's no need to poll the server, poll the asset. We're simply pushing traps through SCADA-wall and allowing them to be delivered. I do see a question that's just come in about clarification on how we support TCP. And the question makes reference to TCP handshaking. And of course, that's true. Normally, TCP does require a 3-way handshake. But strictly speaking, you don't, if you're opening a TCP socket and you choose not to wait for the return path on that handshake, you don't have to. And that's exactly how syslog works over TCP. Syslog simply opens the TCP socket and starts sending. And in the case of a TCP rule on SCADA-wall, that's all we're doing, is we're allowing the incoming connection request or socket request to be accepted. We're terminating it locally on the blue interface, but we do not require a return path handshake from the destination device on the red side, and that's the critical difference. So the log source inside Blue Network completes its normal TCP handshake, but the handshake is performed with the blue side interface of SCADA-wall rather than with the external asset on the red side of the network. The next use case is to do with surveillance video. So a lot of network connected video cameras will broadcast streaming video over UDP protocols. And generally speaking, the way they work is you register them as part of the initial setup of the camera with your video server. So in the SCADA-wall scenario, you define the blue side IP address as the video server that the camera needs to talk to. And then you configure a rule. And once again, the rule forwards the UDP streaming packets, replicates them across SCADA-wall, and then delivers them to the ultimate destination IP, which is the real video server on the red side of the device. So we can do physical surveillance support for UDP-enabled network cameras. Next use case to talk about is to do with sensor data. In an IoT scenario, again, these tend to be lightweight sensors, and a lot of them make use of MQTT as the standard architecture. And the goal there is essentially you configure your sensor to speak to SCADA wall blue as if it were your MQTT broker. But we use the SN variant of the protocol, which is UDP, and the rule in SCADA wall is configured to replicate that traffic to the real broker, which is hosted on the red side of the network. And again, this is just continuous real time, and it just works. And the intention there is, again, you have a large population of sensors. You don't want somebody to be able to go in and interact with them directly, but you do want to keep real-time track on what they're doing. The next question here, or the next use case, is to do with OPC. So for OPC, we've built a proprietary connector. The SCADA wall systems themselves are Linux-based. And for those of you who know about OPCDA, you'll remember that it's a Windows DCOM-based protocol. So what we have is an adapter which essentially acts as a client on the blue side, pulls OPC points and data into SCADA wall blue, replicates them to red, where we then deliver them to, in effect, an OPC server. And then from there, the customers are able to connect to that device and pull the data in real time. And we support very, very high-speed refresh intervals, as quick as 2 millisecond intervals for OPC points. So you can use this for a bunch of different legacy devices and applications. You can use it for different SCADA tools. There's a whole range of use cases that are enabled through OPCDA. Last one to talk about on this page is Modbus server. And again, works in much the same way, except without the use of the Windows DCOM. So SCADA wall blue, it acts as a Modbus client, pulls data in, replicates it across through a rule that you configure in the Windows management application, and then delivers it to a Modbus server, which is hosted on the red side. And from there, the customer can configure whatever Modbus client they have to retrieve the data and move it on into other applications. Final discussion about some of these use cases, the file transfer situation. So we support two, and these are another proprietary connector that we've built. The way they work for Windows is the customer defines a known shared Windows volume using SMB or one of the supported transports, provides the credentials for that share in the SCADA wall configuration. SCADA wall then scans that volume and looks for the arrival of new files. When it finds a file, it ingests it, and then we perform deep content inspection on that file. So we're looking for two things. First of all, we're looking for whether or not the file type is permitted. And so the customer has the ability to define an egress filter on simple groups or individual file types. So they might have a rule that says Microsoft Office files cannot leave the network. Doesn't matter what's in them, just as a rule, you can do rules like that, or you can enumerate individual types. So that's the first part of the scan. The second part is against a database of approximately, at this point, 35 million threat intelligence signatures for malware and malicious code, all sorts of other different sorts of threat vectors. And again, we're scanning these files regardless of file type and looking for any matches against the threat intelligence database. And assuming it passes both of those checks, we will then deliver the file to the red side and on to the designated file share repository the customer has configured. And we can perform the same basic mechanism with either Windows or with FTP transports. So if you have, for example, a workstation that generates a daily production report, or a current status of health indicators, or an inventory report, all of these sorts of things can be replicated automatically across SCADA wall and delivered into broader corporate management application systems. And you can keep tracks that way without physically going to the trusted domain, copying data, making use of out-of-band comms. Just to go back to Modbus for a minute, there was a question about how many soft points it supports for Modbus. We've tested in the tens of thousands. So I'd say a fairly large number. It is ultimately driven by the byte length for all the different registers and coils, and how many are being scanned and at what interval. but broadly speaking, it is a very large number. Okay, so we also have the option of introducing a bilateral connection path. Now, I spoke earlier about how the hardware diode vendors offer this capability, but require you to use a second set of hardware. We offer a flavor of SCADA wall, which enables this capability, but without the use of additional hardware. Now, it's important to understand a unidirectional SCADA wall, which is the default configuration, cannot become a bilateral SCADA wall. Completely different builds on the servers, the software necessary for bilateral rules simply isn't present on a unidirectional device. But for customers who want a bilateral device, which for example is most likely to be used with SQL database replication, Microsoft SQL, MySQL, Oracle, things like this. For scenarios in which the customer wants an application like that, we can define a bilateral rule. And the difference here is that instead of simply having a unidirectional flow to a specified destination, we also add an additional factor to the rule, which is what kind of return communication from that specific destination is allowed. And that defines, again, a specific source for that return path, which has to be the same as the destination that we've already delivered data to. And then the specific port that's going to be used, and whether it's a TCP or UDP port. So this can be used to enable a bilateral path for any traditional application that uses statically assigned port numbers. And again, we don't require you to accept this, but for customers who want to use it, it is available as an option. And we'll be happy to discuss the particulars with those customers if they need that sort of application. So let's talk about some business applications for all of this. And this sort of goes back to the why question that we started with at the beginning of the session. The first thing that we need to remember is that the most common reason to use a product like this is to enable reporting to external networks. So here we have a pretty typical Purdue diagram for a variety of different devices, all the way down to level 0. But what we're focusing on is really just the SCADA wall piece. The SCADA wall piece sits probably at level 3 in most situations. And we have a situation there where the asset owner has been asked to accept a connection from an external party. And so the example we'll use is a regional utility where the local city authority have their own network and they want to have eyeballs on what the utility is doing. Now, traditionally, the city network would come along, or their IT people, and they would say, I want to put a firewall in so that I can define a rule and let my people come in and interrogate your devices directly. And now what we've given the operator, the asset owner, is an ability to say, I can meet your information requirements in real time, but I can do it without either of us having to take the risk of something bad happening because your people are snooping around inside a network they don't fully understand. And this is a benefit to both sides. And this is the important point. Right? Enabling safe replication to an external network is better for everyone than taking the risk of introducing inbound connectivity and then having the possibility of bad things happen. And so the default answer, when you think about the recovery costs from even a single violation, the default answer should be to use a device like SCADA wall instead of accepting the danger of a conventional firewall-based connection. And the reason why is that most of these external networks probably have some sort of internet connectivity. They certainly have a wide and diversified user population that, they're going to be running typical enterprise desktop applications. They're going to be running, Nmap. They're going to be running Windows NetBIOS tools. They're going to have domain controllers. They're going to have Windows Update staging servers. All of these sorts of things introduce risks to automation and control networks, which we don't need to accept. And that's the critical goal. The secondary goal, things like malware propagation over that firewall rule, or even let's imagine a scenario where somebody hand carries malware into the production network, the control system. And it then needs to find an internet gateway in order to communicate with its command and control host. The automation network may not have had any sort of internet directly accessible gateway, but this firewall rule may allow it. And the danger there is, again, if we're allowing command and control sessions to find a way out, the danger is that they're going to take instructions and be able to propagate much more aggressively. So SCADA enables safe, completely one-way replication of the full data that the external party wants to see, but without requiring any increased connectivity risk. And that is a huge advantage. The second example I'll talk about, which is similar to one of the themes I just mentioned, is to do with eliminating malware propagation via segmentation. We all understand that generally speaking, if you let the genie out of the bottle inside an open network, that these malware tools can propagate very rapidly. We just saw a ransomware attack against Honda, and it impacted some large number of their worldwide manufacturing sites. And the reason that was possible can only be because there was not a lot of segmentation between those sites. We'll probably learn more as the forensics continue. But the interesting thing that was revealed early on was that the malware build that targeted Honda specifically was making use of a known internal DNS entry. And the idea was that the malware would perform a DNS query, and assuming it got a response for that known internal Honda domain name, it knew it was still on a Honda network, and it would continue to try and propagate. So again, simply preventing that malware from contacting DNS would have curtailed its propagation very effectively. But nobody knows that at the time it's happened. So the question is, why do we not apply segmentation up front in order to avoid the risk? Ransomware and generally propagating malware still tend to target Windows-based workstations first and foremost. And we all know that in our industrial control systems, there's a lot of Windows. There can be Windows embedded running on the HMIs. There can be standard Windows, it can be old, it can be more recent, running on our workstations and programming stations. Our SCADA servers are all typically Windows-based. And the reality is that these systems don't get patched as often as the typical enterprise or IT systems, and they are often running in full production with limited or no practical failover or redundancy. And so the danger here is, once a piece of malware gets a toehold inside that network, it's going to do everything it can to propagate. And SCADA prevents any of those outbound or return path communications from a microsegment to the outside world. It's very simple. If you imagine SCADA in front of whatever you designate as a protected segment, and you've enumerated in rules all the possible communications that segment should be allowed to have with the rest of the network, anything that's outside of that simply won't be possible. It won't be able to connect in any way across SCADA to the rest of the network. The third question is a question I often encourage customers to think about. If you look at any given device on your network, you should be able to point to it and ask yourself if it really needs to be accessible to everything else on the network. And this is a sort of delicate way to find out whether they have any sort of subnets, any kind of VLANs, any kind of logical separation or segmentation already set up in their network. And the answer is usually a bit of a mixed bag. It's like, yeah, we have a little, but we've been trying to figure out how to do more, and it's been going on for a few years, and it's just never quite at the top of the list. Now, clearly, there are a lot of sort of networking suppliers that would love for those asset owners to sort of rip out their whole network and build entirely new ones from scratch with all the latest best practices. And that's great if you can afford it. But it's difficult and it's time consuming, and it doesn't provide immediate mitigation for the risk. So SCADA offers a simple way to add incremental segments for your most critical assets, and you get to choose. There's no need to deploy these across your entire network simultaneously. And the goal here is, let's prioritize those assets, figure out which ones are most critical and therefore cannot be at risk of unauthorized activity or even being party to a broader sort of malware event. Let's put a SCADA wall in front. And then, maybe next quarter or 6 months down the road, the time comes and we do another one. And maybe next year we identify a few more exposed critical assets. Same thing, put a SCADA wall in front of those. And you get to choose the cadence. The customer doesn't have to change anything else in their network in order for this to work. They don't need to readdress anything. don't need to change the switch fabric, don't need to do anything else other than insert the device and define the rules. And as I mentioned, that's an afternoon's work or less. No new networks, no new firewalls, none of the connectivity risks, and maximum protection due to the rigid isolation that SCADA wall provides. So let's talk about how to prioritize this strategy. I like to remind people, why does security matter? Security matters not because, of all the nuts and bolts and technical details. Security matters because risk is never zero. And it is our job to manage risk. And we can do that essentially through two different ways. We can reduce the risk of a bad thing happening to any given target, or we can reduce the consequences after the bad thing happens. But we need to identify those assets, and we need to identify the potential range of consequences in order to understand this question. And we further need to understand that anything we can't transfer, so you can transfer, for example, personal risk of fixing your car to an auto insurance policy. And you pay a fixed premium for your policy, and it provides variable coverage for a risk, right? And you've assigned that, you've transferred that into a fixed cost. You can mitigate the risk by no longer owning a car, which is of course an expensive effect. Or you can simply accept, yes, I own a car, yes, I'm gonna drive it, and I live somewhere where I'm not actually legally obligated to carry insurance, so I accept the risk up to and including criminal prosecution and jail time if I hurt someone with my car. And those are pretty dire consequences, and most of us will generally choose not to live with that. We'll choose to find a more effective way to address that risk. So we recommend here the customer, they need to start somewhere. And we provide a tool called Scrutiny, which I'll show you in a minute. So I'll show you how it works, which is free. And Scrutiny is designed to give you, a strong foundation from which to start. It gives you a report of all the assets on your network and all the network activity that they're performing and interacting with all the other assets on your network. And I would encourage you to ask very simple questions. Look at all those assets and ask yourself how big a deal it would be if any of those assets were compromised. And you should be able to group them into these three sorts of buckets. Not really a big deal, kind of a big deal, and oh my God, I'm going to be on the 6 o'clock news, or perhaps more importantly, my boss is going to be on the 6 o'clock news and it's going to be bad. And those are, they're not meant to be glib. These are pretty standard classifications, because at the end of the day, if we deal with a network problem or a security problem, the first decision that we evaluate is whether we need to stop what we're doing now, or if we can catch up with it later. And that's the distinction between, a big deal problem and not really that big a deal problem. So we encourage you to identify your assets and group them into this situation. And then the second question is, what's going to be required for any asset that is in that third category, that high risk category? What's it going to take to move it to a lower risk category? And the answer is usually, some mixture of time, money, and other dependencies. But to move something from group 3 to group 2 is a lot easier than to move it from group 3 to group 1. And that's very much, a deliberate effect of this analysis. Our goal is, we're never going to have perfect network security. There's too many unknown risks. But what we're trying to do is ensure that we're not cavalier about accepting excessive risk. And so identifying your assets and organizing them according to simple buckets, and then prioritizing what you're going to do to shift the risk into a more, mitigated category is an effective exercise. And the final part of this is set a goal. It doesn't have to be what I've listed here literally. It doesn't need to be, half of your group 3 problems addressed within 6 to 12 months. It might be 20% of them in a week. I don't know. Everybody's going to have a different ability to respond and to allocate resources towards these challenges. But set a goal that you can live with. And then, if you hit it, great, set a more aggressive goal next time. If you miss it, take the time to understand why you misunderstood it or what happened that caused you not to hit the target. And get into the habit of going through this on at least a monthly basis, because it's not an unreasonable exercise, and you'll find that it makes the overwhelming challenge of addressing a broad whole network risk profile and makes it much more approachable. Don't forget, anything you cannot mitigate, you have to accept. You don't have the option of burying your head in the sand and ignoring it. And the challenge there is, make sure you know the full list of things you have to consider so that you're not, guilty of simply ignorance over the scope of the risk exposure. Bayshore, of course, can help you with this. Bayshore offers a family of automated security protection tools for industrial networks. We've spoken about SCADA wall at length today. We also offer two other hardware products, one called SCADA Fuse, which is an endpoint protection tool, essentially an automated industrial security appliance, provides full deep content inspection on live traffic as it targets your critical assets, your PLCs, your RTUs, maybe your HMIs. And all of their interactions with your control system, your historian, your SCADA tools, your thin and thick clients, your view nodes, all these sorts of relationships. And it enforces policy about what's allowed to happen. It learns automatically all the different protocol activity in the native function codes that the protocols use. And it will then deal with all of those function codes in three simple categories. It organizes them as read-only, read and write, or full access. And the customer then says, okay, I know that my programming workstation needs full access, but it doesn't need full access 24 hours a day. So I'm going to have a rule that I can enable as needed for that programming workstation to make changes to my PLC. And the rest of the time, no access at all is permitted. At the same time, your historian may have read access. And if we suddenly saw your historian starting to push new values to a register or upload a new program to a PLC, we're going to stop that. SCADA Fuse will detect that in real time and block it. And you get an alert that's pushed to your control room to ensure that your operators have immediate visibility on what's going on. We also offer a version of SCADA Fuse specifically for GE Digital and their iFix SCADA suite. And it works in much the same way. The difference is instead of sitting in front of the PLCs, it sits in front of the SCADA servers themselves. The final tool that we offer is a remote access solution called OT Access. And the way it works is very different from a VPN. A VPN, again, it goes back to a firewall. A typical firewall will terminate a VPN connection, and then the user is allowed to do whatever they want for the duration of their authenticated session. In OT Access, we start in the opposite direction. We look at an asset, we say, what's the minimum access required in order for somebody to interact with this device? And that's probably network access to a single port on that device. And then we further apply the same policy controls of read-only, read-write, or full access for every enumerated user that needs any kind of access into it. And then finally, we only allow the user into the plant network through a TLS tunnel, which we initiate from the inside to the outside. So there's no requirement of punching a hole through a perimeter firewall to allow remote users in. And of course, the customer has the ability to control this, manage schedules, revoke access, anything else they need. And so OT Access provides that. This reference diagram shows the logical placement for all the different devices, and it gives me an opportunity to introduce the fourth product, which I mentioned previously, which is Scrutiny. Scrutiny is the free software tool that allows you to build your asset records and look at all your network activity between them. And all it needs is either a span port on a central switch, or you can just feed it offline PCAP files, and it will passively digest those. It's not a scanning tool. It is purely a passive tool. So it looks at packet traffic and derives its intelligence from what it sees. And you just run it occasionally, once a week, once a month, whatever you need to do. It's not meant to be running continuously. And again, we encourage customers to figure out what is a realistic interval that they can stick to, on an ongoing basis. So what to do next? Well, certainly we encourage you to download Scrutiny and try it out. You can go to bayshorenetworks.com/scrutiny and register for it, and you'll get a license agreement, which you can click through, and then you can download the tool. We would ask that if you're working with a Bayshore partner, please make note of the partner in the form when you fill it out, so that we can make sure that everybody knows what customer activity is going on. Learn to understand the reports. If you're not sure what to make of the reports, ask for help. don't be afraid to say, you know what, let's get these reports and meet for lunch and chat about it. Maybe it's Zoom lunch at this point, but regardless, set aside some time and work with somebody you trust to go through the results and see what they mean. From there, decide what changes are possible. Classify your assets, as I said previously. Figure out whether you need to make policy changes, process changes, whether you do need new technology, whether you do need new people. That's the most expensive part of this. The standard security triad is people, process, and technology. And in fact, that's in decreasing order of cost. People are most expensive, process second most expensive. Technology usually is the cheapest. And the goal there is, define the size of a bite you can chew and don't bite off too much, because we want you to be able to make some meaningful progress in an amount of time that you're comfortable with. And be honest about it. Clearly a lot of customers, their networking needs have evolved rapidly in recent years. But the same time, if you don't need to enable full visibility across your network to all of these different servers and workstations, then it's a fair question to ask why you should provide it. Recognize that if you do provide that kind of visibility, you're going to accept additional risk. And it doesn't need to be malicious. It can be accidental. Don't forget that a lot of faults in industrial control networks originate from the inside with trusted individuals. Make sure that you're comfortable asking for help. Whether you work with security specialists, whether you work with your existing partners, your resellers, your integrators, make sure that you ask for help. Talk to your peers in your industry vertical. Find out what they're doing. Look for opportunities to increase your knowledge base and how to align it with your business objectives. But above all else, commit to mitigating some aspect of that risk. SCADA is a very, very effective way to mitigate the risk of exposed network devices by applying segmentation and allowing data to move across that segment boundary. If you have a situation where you've got external stakeholders, they want access to your network, the standard answer can easily be, yes, of course, we're going to do it with a SCADA wall. And there's no reason that you can't do that. This is a summary of Bayshore channel partners. We encourage you to get in touch with them if you're not already. If you're not sure who to get in touch with, you can always contact Bayshore directly and we'll be happy to arrange a referral for you. But we do encourage you to take that first step. Commit to the journey and recognize that you're going to come out of it with a better understanding of your network, a better understanding of your business, and ultimately probably a more robust infrastructure to show for it. I'll pause there. Thank you all for your time and attention, and I'll hand it back to Catherine.
Yes, thanks, Toby. There was one question that came up that I thought I'd add for you to address directly.
Sure.
And it was that in the case of SCADA wall, where we have to define rules, in the case that we missed to define the rule related to internet access, is it possible that the plant historian could be accessed from outside the network?
No, if the rule isn't present and the device that you want to enable connectivity for is not covered by a rule, then ultimately no, there is no way for that device to be accessed on the other side of SCADA wall. That's ultimately the whole point, right? We don't want to allow you to do an end run around the security perimeter. So the intention is that you have to know what rules you need and then test them to make sure that they work in the way you expect.
It's sort of a deny all, initially, right? A default is do not allow connect, and then the rule set needs to be developed for what you will allow rule set. But no matter what, with SCADA wall, the information is outgoing one way, and getting back is not possible through it.
That's right. That's exactly right.
There was also a question that I answered in the chat, but it was about scrutiny network scanning, just in case you have more to add. The question was, is this good for listing down all the OT devices on the network? And particularly, I took issue, it is not a network scanning tool per se. So go ahead.
That's right. Scrutiny is not a scanner. So it does not interrogate assets directly. It only observes network traffic that the devices generate. And it knows the source IP, the destination IP, the port, and the protocol that that traffic is using. And from that, it can derive information about what the assets are, what the connection paths look like, the volume of connections by protocol. All that sort of analysis is provided. So I really do encourage everyone to register and download the tool. Try it out for yourselves so you can see exactly what the results look like.
Okay, then that's it for what's open. Are there any others who, we just got a new one. See, I love it when that happens. People get intrigued by something that's said.
The question is, how do we compare with, there are a number of very high quality OT network visibility tools. And the question that's been asked is about one of them, a company called Nozomi Networks. Nozomi provides a continuous monitoring tool and vulnerability management platform. And it's a great tool. It's a really, really nice tool. I think it's fantastic, and they've done a really good job building it. The problem is it's very expensive. And the reality for a lot of our customers is that they don't necessarily have a 5-figure budget to spend on asset discovery. And they don't have the staff, importantly, that can process the volume of alerts that continuous monitoring can generate. They've got 1 or 2 people trying to run the whole network, keep the SCADA system going, and respond to requests from external stakeholders. So in that situation, 100 emails a day or alerts a day from a tool like Nozomi is just not realistic. They're not going to be able to make use of it. Scrutiny does not provide all the same functionality. It is definitely a lightweight tool compared to a 5-figure spend. But you run it when you want. You can choose how much data you generate, and therefore how much time you need to spend on it. And for some customers, it might be once a quarter. Others, it might be once a week, but it's your decision. And you're not looking at an expensive purchase and feeling like you're wasting it because you're not able to make full use of it.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that often, especially having come from a company that does the visibility monitoring such as Nozomi, is that our tool is sort of a snapshot in time. And very often the customers that we work with don't need the big giant solution as much as they need just a first look at what assets are in the system and where they are and what protocols are underway. They don't really need the broader, much bigger solution. As you pointed out, they couldn't manage most of it anyway. So It's the difference between an ongoing, steady, continuous monitoring versus a snapshot in time. All right. Well, let's see here. I think unless there are other questions that we might just call it, and we could make this available, or any other questions that folks have. Please, you've got Toby's and my email. I'm more, Toby is the technical, and I am not as much there, but I'd be happy to route you to the right people. If you did email either one of us, we can make sure you get handled. Thank you for your time and attendance. I think we'll call it up.
Very good. Thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate you participating this afternoon.
Thank you, Toby. Bye-bye.
All right, take care.